Today we will be looking at a case from the very end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Lena Marilla Brewster was born on the 5th of June 1877 and grew up in the countryside near the small town of Huntingdon in Chittenden County, Vermont. She was christened Lena Marilla, but everyone referred to her as Mildred. She was the youngest of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, although sadly her sister died when Mildred was a child. Her father, Mr. Wesley Brewster, was a very wealthy gentleman, having amassed a fortune in farming. But Mildred's life was not easy. Her mother passed away in 1892, when Mildred was just 15 years old, and the loss seemed to profoundly affect her. She was sent away to study at Burlington High School, but upon completing her studies, she returned to her hometown of Huntingdon, where she found employment as a teacher. However, she was restless and yearned for a life of more adventure. Determined to seek new horizons, she went to Montpelier, Vermont's capital city, where she obtained work for the family of Mr. S.C. Shirtliff. In early 1896, she left his employment and went to work in a hotel in the town of Northfield, before returning to Montpelier, where she took a room in the boarding house of Mr. John F. Goodenough. She secured work as a tailor for a company named Ledden and Campbell, where she immersed herself in the craft of clothing design. While in the boarding house, she'd be visited by a young man named John Wheeler. He was originally from Canada, but had come to the city with his mother and brother, and worked as a granite cutter for the company Fraser and Bradford. A few months later, he too took a room at the boarding house. The two seemed to be quite close. However, unbeknown to Mildred, John was actually engaged to another lady named Annie Wheeler, their shared surname being merely coincidental. Miss Annie Wheeler was known in the area, not only for her beauty, but also her poise and elegance. With her radiant smile and gentle demeanour, she exuded charm that seemed to enchant all who crossed her path. She worked in domestic service in the house of Mr. C.E. Bugby, who had a large property on Liberty Street, but she had grown up in East Montpelier on her parents' farm. They were a respectable family, and although not particularly wealthy, had been described as well-to-do. John had asked Annie if she would go with him to the Decoration Day celebrations at the end of May in the nearby town of Barre, and of course, she accepted. However, when Mildred Brewster learned that Miss Wheeler would be accompanying John, she was most displeased, so much so that she decided to confront the young lady about it. On Saturday the 29th of May, she went directly to the house where Miss Wheeler lived and demanded that she release her grip on John. In a strange sort of desperate plea, Mildred told her that she was with John and that if she did not stop seeing him, she would kill him. It seemed that her words were tinged with desperation and a deep-seated fear of losing the man who she believed she loved. Although Annie knew that John was engaged to her, she listened to what Mildred had to say, especially when Mildred claimed to also be engaged to him. The 2 young women decided to walk the half-mile through the city to the boarding house of Mr. Goodenough and confront Mr. Wheeler. They walked side by side, sharing an umbrella, their conversation fraught with unspoken tension. The path led them into College Street, past the cemetery, and towards the boarding house nestled along Sibley Avenue. Suddenly, as they were very close to their destination, Mildred produced a revolver and, aiming it directly at Annie's head, fired, shooting her just below the ear. The sound of gunshots shattered the stillness of the day. As Annie fell to the ground mortally wounded, Mildred then turned the weapon on herself and fired, a desperate act born out of anguish and despair. Those who observed the unfolding tragedy swiftly gathered at the scene, among them John Wheeler and his brother. The unconscious women were taken to Mr. Goodenough's boarding house before the police and medical assistance arrived. From there, they were both transported to Heaton Hospital. Doctors tried valiantly to save Annie, but her wounds were too great, and the same afternoon, she died. Mildred was still living, but doctors were unsure if she would survive. Sheriff Bancroft went to the boarding house where Miss Brewster resided. He searched her room and in a drawer found a broken box of cartridges and a note neatly written and signed by Miss Brewster. He read it, noting the subtle details that hinted at the emotional turmoil the young lady endured. Everything he found would be looked at as possible evidence. Mildred Brewster did regain consciousness, but when nurses attended her, she shouted, "Oh, why couldn't I have died?" Annie's body was taken to her parents' house in East Montpellier, where the funeral took place a mere few days later. The sombre occasion drew sizable crowds of mourners, paying their respects to the popular 17-year-old. Mr. John Wheeler mourned deeply. Some who knew him best wondered that if in his grief he sought solace and redemption with regret and sorrow as he confronted the consequences of his actions. The police began an investigation. It appeared that jealousy over Annie Wheeler's relationship with Mr. John Wheeler, a young man whom Mildred thought she was engaged, had driven her to commit the murder, but investigators started to unravel that there was more to 20-year-old Miss Brewster. 2 weeks prior to the shooting, she had in fact lost her position at Ledden and Campbell and had told her friends that she would be returning to Huntingdon to take up residence with her father. Witnesses recounted how Mildred had travelled to Barry to purchase the revolver and had staked out the armoury on the day preceding the shooting. It was believed that she was waiting for John's emergence from rifle practice, perhaps as she planned to shoot him. However, when he finished, he left in the company of friends, which is thought why Mildred instead retreated to the boarding house. Acquaintances of Mildred later admitted that she had confided in them her intent to harm John Wheeler, yet they brushed off her words as the fleeting frustrations of a disillusioned young woman. The case soon became a media frenzy. Mr. Wesley Brewster kept a vigil at his daughter's bedside, and doctors gave daily updates on her condition. Each one was then printed in the newspapers. Although she was conscious and speaking, medical staff had been unable to remove the bullet from her head, and doctors were unsure if she would ultimately live. If she did survive, she would face a grave accusation of premeditated murder. By the end of June, doctors announced that they believed that Miss Brewster would survive her attempted suicide. However, she stayed in hospital for many months as the police investigated the crime further, and a case was built against her for the shooting of Miss Annie Wheeler. With her trial scheduled for November 1897, her defence attorney, Mr. William A. Lord, initially entered a plea of not guilty. However, this plea was swiftly retracted as he instead challenged the indictment. His contention stemmed from the presence of a stenographer during the grand jury deliberations, which he argued was irregular and potentially detrimental to his client's case. The matter was elevated to the State Supreme Court, which convened in January 1898 to determine this critical issue. Despite Mildred's confinement to a hospital bed due to her ongoing convalescence, both legal teams agreed to conduct the session in her hospital room. Thus, from her bedside, Mildred listened attentively to the legal arguments presented before the justices. March brought forth the decision of the Supreme Court, which found no grounds to invalidate the indictment, and consequently, Mildred's trial was adjourned and rescheduled for a later date, prolonging the legal proceedings and adding to the uncertainty surrounding her fate. The trial of Mildred Brewster eventually began on the 4th of April 1898 in Montpellier. There was much public interest in the case, and the court was full. Mildred was now considered physically capable of attending court and was provided with a rocking chair in order for her to sit during the proceedings. She entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The state's argument, however, stood firm and unequivocal. Mildred Brewster was the one who pulled the trigger, with evidence suggesting meticulous planning. Her purchase of a revolver prior to the tragic event, coupled with eyewitness accounts of her practicing at the shooting range on the fateful morning, painted a compelling picture of premeditation. However, throughout the trial, the defence built a thorough case by presenting a range of testimonies that highlighted Mildred's emotional volatility and showed instances of erratic behaviour. Friends and family shared observations of her rapidly shifting moods and peculiar actions, such as isolating herself in her room and discussing her thoughts of self-harm. Additionally, They provided insights into a possible genetic predisposition to mental health issues within her family. They told the court that Mildred's maternal grandfather had taken his own life by cutting his own throat in an insane frenzy, and her maternal grandfather's brother was also declared to be insane. Two of her great aunts on her father's side ended their days in an institution, and her father's cousin, named Peter Crane, died in a lunatic asylum. The pivotal moment of the defence's case came with the testimony of Dr. F.W. Page, whose extensive examination of Mildred led to the conclusion, outlined in a detailed 4,000-word report, that she suffered from mental illness and was not accountable for her actions. In his conversations with Mildred, Dr. Page had gathered an insight into the turmoil within her, and contrary to the prosecution's narrative, she had revealed to him that the purchase of the revolver was not a calculated act of violence against Annie Wheeler, but rather a desperate response to the betrayal she felt from John Wheeler. She recounted how his assurances of love and commitment had fueled her hopes of marriage, only to be shattered upon discovering his impending union with another woman. This revelation of his broken promises plunged her into profound despair, driving her to contemplate drastic measures in the throes of heartbreak. This web of emotions outlined the profound impact of the young man's actions on Mildred's fragile mental state. Although John Wheeler had previously denied any romantic involvement with Mildred, testimonies from witnesses suggested a closer relationship. Mrs. Goodenough, the defendant's landlady, told the court that Mildred had a room in their boarding house, and since 1896, John Wheeler had been a frequent visitor. She believed that he used to visit Mildred at least 3 times a week. She added that she always saw them as acting love-like. However, she did say that after Mildred had returned from a visit to Huntingdon, she was very thin and pale, and when taking the sheets from the bed, she had noticed a large bloodstain on the mattress. There was also a strange odour in the room. Mrs. Goodenough went on to say that the couple argued frequently, but always seemed to make up afterwards. Mr. Juan Coyenes, a close acquaintance of both Mildred and John, revealed more details about their relationship. He recounted how John had confided in him, expressing regret over promises made to Mildred, and suggesting a willingness to marry her, if not for the fact he was also with Annie Wheeler. Mr. Coyenes delicately hinted at a distressing turn of events, implying that Mildred had found herself in a difficult situation and had sought medical assistance, possibly for matters related to pregnancy. Through his testimony, he shed light on the complexities of the emotional entanglements between Mildred Brewster and John Wheeler, evoking empathy in the court for the challenges they faced amidst societal expectations and personal struggles. Mr. Warren Morse, a carpenter from Burlington, testified in court regarding his acquaintance with Miss Brewster from her school days. He recalled instances when they shared meals together, noting that while she could be agreeable and friendly at times, there were occasions when she remained silent for days on end. This observation was corroborated by Mr. Eugene Cooney, who also testified to also witnessing prolonged periods of Miss Brewster's silence, which lasted up to a week. He further described her demeanour during these times as cold, unfriendly and vacant. All of these testimonies added to the defence's claim that the defendant was indeed of unsound mind. In a poignant testimony, Mildred's father, Mr. Wesley Brewster, recounted the family history to the court. He told how Mildred was the youngest of his 4 children. He spoke of his wife's struggles with mental illness, painting a backdrop of family vulnerability to psychological challenges. Furthermore, he shared insights into Mildred's own peculiar behaviour, noting that until the age of 9, she exhibited behaviours that veered from the norm. At around 15, she suffered from frequent bouts of crying and harboured thoughts of self-harm. He went on to say that in the months he was with her in hospital, she would beg him to bring chloroform so she could end her life. Despite these distressing episodes, he recounted instances of compassion where she expressed remorse and assured him that the shooting of Miss Annie Wheeler was never her intention. This testimony provided the court with an understanding of Mildred's troubled upbringing and her internal struggles. John Wheeler gave evidence. He said that he had known Mildred Brewster for over 2 years and had regularly called on her at different boarding houses. Despite his previous statements to police, saying that he had never had a relationship with her. When questioned under oath, he admitted to being intimate with her and that this intimacy had gone on for some time. He added that he had been acquainted with Miss Wheeler before he had met Miss Brewster and had told Miss Brewster about his engagement to Annie. When asked how she reacted, he said that she was most displeased, but he added that he had never been engaged to Miss Brewster. Under cross-examination, Mr. Wheeler was asked if he knew that Miss Brewster had been with child. He said he did not. However, when pushed on the subject, he said that he knew that she had gone away, but was never sure if the reason she gave him for it was true. The defence suggested to Mr. Wheeler that Mildred found herself in a difficult situation and had sought medical assistance, possibly for matters relating to pregnancy, but the witness was evasive in his answers. The prosecution endeavoured to dispute the defence's claim that Mildred was insane by presenting witnesses who vouched for the mental stability of the Brewster family. However, despite their efforts to portray Mildred as mentally sound, the complexities of the case persisted, leaving the jury to weigh the evidence carefully in their deliberations. The trial lasted for 32 days, and when the jury was sent out to deliberate, they did so for 18 hours, before returning the following day to find the defendant, Miss Mildred Brewster, not guilty by reason of insanity. Although Mr. Wesley Brewster was unable to conceal his feelings upon hearing the verdict, Mildred received the news in the same indifferent manner that had characterised her actions throughout the trial. She was then committed to the State Asylum for the Insane at Waterbury. Mildred spent the following decade at the asylum, where assessments of her mental state from staff were inconsistent. In 1908, she briefly experienced freedom when placed in the care of a childhood friend, only to be readmitted to Waterbury shortly thereafter. Another 8 years passed in institutional care before she was granted release once more, this time under the guardianship of a nurse who had previously tended to her. With a sheriff escort, Mildred journeyed across the country to Seattle, where she resided until her death on the 27th of April 1942, at the age of 64. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case